Hi everybody, I'm Brant at Crocker Farm Auction, and we have an auction coming up on May 23rd, 2019. So as usual, we're going through some of those lots and just sort of using that as an opportunity to also get into some of the history of American stoneware. And this is a great opportunity to talk about the earliest stoneware made in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is one of the beloved centers of American stoneware production. The name that you usually will associate with Harrisburg is Calden and Wilcox, and they've got one of those names alongside J. Lee Norton, Clarkson, Crolius. It's one of these iconic producers of American stoneware. But here we're talking about the predecessors to Calden and Wilcox and how that craft really got started in Harrisburg. And while we talk about that, we also need to talk about why this stuff looks so much like New York State stoneware, whereas things that were being made in other parts of the state didn't look so much like New York State stoneware. And the reason for that is that this was sort of a conscious effort to bring New York State potters down and have them make what they were making in upstate New York, for instance, in Lyons, New York. So one potter in particular named Shem Thomas, whose name never appears on any Harrisburg maker's marks, was actually one of the key potters that helped get that going. And then we're going to talk about another one of those potters in a second. But anyway, the first two marks used in Harrisburg were not the marks of potters, but the marks of a merchant named Thomas Hill Willson, who along with his brothers started the first stoneware pottery in Harrisburg. So this bears one of their two marks, the more desirable of the two, T.H. Willson and Co., along with a really cool rendition of the Capitol building in Harrisburg. Now, the current Capitol building is actually a newer version of this. This building that you see on the crock burned down in 1897. But this is considered, because of the incorporation of the Capitol building, because of the rarity of the stamp. T.H. Willson was only in business from 1852 to 1855, and this is the rarer of those two stamps. This is considered one of the more desirable American stoneware maker's marks that there is. And in fact, this is the first one of these we've ever handled, attesting to its rarity. In the middle here, we have one marked Wilson's and Young with this wonderful decoration that is way more reminiscent of what you'll eventually see on, say, Calden and Wilcox stoneware. And Wilson's and Young is a really short-lived maker's mark that was apparently only used around the end of 1855 when the Willson brothers, hence Wilsons, plural, and a New York State potter named John Young were in partnership together. So this, like the Capitol stamp, side by side, these are like the two rarest Harrisburg, Pennsylvania maker's marks. And due to their relatively early dates and their importance to the history of the craft there, these are very desirable examples of Harrisburg stoneware. So then, the Young in Wilson's and Young, John Young, who is a fellow potter of Shem Thomas from upstate New York, the two of them strike out on their own and take over the pottery. And they begin to use the stamp John Young and Co. Now, you will see pieces marked John Young and Co., Harrisburg, PA, that are made in this exact style, in the sense of both the shape of the jug, which is an unusual shape, versus later, say, Calden and Wilcox products, J.W. Calden products, but also in this wild slip trail design. And if you don't have Matthew Miller's book on Calden and Wilcox and related Harrisburg stoneware, you really ought to get a hold of it. That's a really great book. I think Matthew was just a college student when he put that together, but he had the ability to get into some of those key Harrisburg collections. He went around and photographed everything and did a lot of really good research and put together a really cool book the best of its kind on Harrisburg Stoneware. But in there, you'll see pieces that are clearly by the same hand as decorated this jug. And so it's always been my understanding, at least, that Harrisburg collectors have tended to ascribe pieces that only say Harrisburg, PA on them, as this jug does, to William Moyer, who was a subsequent potter. But it's obvious based on both this example and when we sold at a previous auction that at least some of them were made by John Young. And since John Young is a very desirable maker's mark in its own right, this is also a really rare piece of Harrisburg Stoneware. And one last thing I'd like to say is, that I meant to mention, is that this design is actually pretty similar to what you see on what is considered by many to be the greatest example of Harrisburg Stoneware in existence at the Dauphin County Historical Society, a wonderful cooler that says "In God We Trust" on it and is stamped also with John Young's maker's mark. And then just to kind of end this, I'm just going to show you a Cowden and Wilcox example and how similar it is, if you're not familiar with their work, to what these earliest potters were making. So you can see they were really piggybacking off of what people like John Young and Shem Thomas were making early on. And I don't know if I mentioned that John Young's mark was only used from like 1856 to 58, and then there were some subsequent marks, but Cowden and Wilcox comes in during the Civil War in 1863. So you can see, though, just how similar this is, this wonderful batter pail, to these other examples in terms of clay color, blue, etc. And we have some really great Cowden examples in this auction as well.